Welcome to the SciPhi Show, where we talk science and philosophy with two of my favourite atheist philosophers, Dan Linford and Alex Malpass. But today we have something new. One of the Christians whose work we've been critical of is joining us. And it's none other than the superstar of panpsychism, Professor of Philosophy at Durham University, Philip Goff. Welcome, Philip.
Thanks, Phil. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me on to chat about these things. Should be fun.
Yeah, it should be. So recently, Philip came out as a Christian, although a somewhat heretical one, and we did a reply video to one of his articles justifying his new stance. But now, Philip, you're going to challenge us on some of our criticisms. But first, you're going to give a presentation on why you've sort of taken this leap of faith. Why don't you take it away and tell us why you've become a Christian?
Okay, well, thanks very much, and I'm very appreciative of you engaging with my stuff, and enjoyed the challenge and wanted to respond on a couple of points, and so I invited myself on, and you're very graciously accepted that offer. Okay, so I'll just try and do a little brief overview of my view here and respond to some points along the way. The first thing I just want to start with that is quite important to me is that I don't believe Christianity to be true, which might sound a bit strange. How can you be a Christian if you don't believe Christianity? And that's, I mean, I think, for example, Karen Armstrong, building on other people's research, has made a good case that it's a kind of modern corruption of the last 500 years or so, that this equation of faith with belief in the modern sense of that word. I prefer to think of faith as about hope or trust. And I think that's important because I think evidence is still relevant, but I think of belief as high confidence that something is true, and you're going to want more evidence for that. But I think for it to be rational to trust in something or to hope that something is true, you need that the bar is lower. I think basically you have to make a case that it's a credible possibility. Maybe 30% is the number I throw up. So typically, that's what I take myself to. I've established here that there's, like, say, a 30% probability that this is true, which is still a significant thing to try to show. Okay, so the starting point hypothesis here, let me note the time so I don't go on too long, is this hypothesis of a God of limited power. So I've slowly over time come to think that, both sides of this perennial debate between God and atheism, both sides get something right and something wrong. Theists struggle to explain the horrific suffering we find in the world. Why would an all-powerful, loving God allow that? But I think there's also things atheists, traditional atheists at least, struggle to explain. For example, the fine-tuning of physics for life, which I think we'll probably focus on a little bit today. Some other things that may be a little bit more complicated to get into. And I think there are middle ground hypotheses that can more elegantly and simply deal with both of these data points. So my book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, explored some of these, and one I find very attractive is the hypothesis of a God of limited power. So a God that's all just like the traditional God, pretty much, except not all powerful. Some things they can do, some things they can't do. And I think this can allow us to explain the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations. Now, if I'm going to defend this, I need to give some account of what God's powers are. Now, if we're just dealing with fine-tuning, we'll deal with Christianity in a moment, but if we're just dealing with fine-tuning, I think we can give a quite simple account of God's powers as follows. Take physics, take the values of the constants out, that will give you a sort of structure, and then we just say, well, God can create a universe from a singularity, from certain initial conditions, with that structure, but can set whatever values to the constants that God wants to, and can't fiddle thereafter, right? That's what God can and can't do. So I think a lot of your responses, we're assuming God's more powerful than this. We're saying, well, why couldn't God make everyone vegetarian? Well, given this account of God's powers, that's just not something God can do. Another response that came up in your video was, well, what explains why God has these limitations? And I'd say, every theory, every hypothesis has to take something as fundamental. What you want is your fundamental axioms to be fairly simple and to explain the data. I think what I've just articulated of God's limitations is pretty damn simple. It's simpler than physics. because it's like physics, but you take the values of the constants out. So if it's simpler than physics, that's good enough for me. And I think it elegantly accounts for the data, both of fine-tuning and of suffering. A lot of people debating William Lane Craig last week. I get a lot. I think this came up in your videos all. Like, or it was sort of assumed, well, if you're powerful enough to do this, but why can't you do these other things? I think that assumes incorrectly. I think that all power is on a sort of neat scale. But as I said in my debate last week, who's more powerful, Putin or the strongest man in the world? They're powerful in different ways. Anyway, the point is, I think this is a simple, coherent proposal and avoids the counterexamples you raised. Okay, that's God of limited powers. So, but my why book didn't talk about Christianity a lot. This was a later thing. So the couple of moves that led me towards a slightly heretical version of Christianity. One thing was learning about the mystical traditions of Christianity that have always been there right back to the start, but are perhaps more pronounced in the Eastern Church. So in the Eastern Orthodox Church's theory of salvation, it's nothing to do with God wanting to punish someone for our sins, punishing Jesus in our place. It's about God and humanity becoming one, entering into a state of deep unity. And the idea is that what the Jesus stuff is all about is that God shared in our form of existence so that we can share in God's form of existence. So, yeah, I thought a lot of Alex's issues here in the video were misunderstanding my view. And maybe it was, it was just this Eon article that wasn't, maybe didn't articulate it well enough. But he was talking about, this thinking my idea was like, we can relate to God more easily because God's become human, and something to do with rituals having a certain magical power or something. And I was agreeing with your criticism. I was saying, that sounds like a terrible view. So it's not like, it's much more metaphysical than that. I think of it as, the idea is that us and God are going to become aspects, parts of a single unified thing, a unified whole. Well, here's an icon from the Eastern Orthodox Church that kind of shows this really. So the thought is, the problem with us and God becoming parts of a unified whole is that we're really different to God, right? So the thought is, for this to happen, God had to become more like us. God had to take on a physical nature so that we're similar enough to become parts of a unified whole. So Robin Collins has a good analogy for this. He says, it's like trying to graft a branch onto a horse. They're just kind of too different. So God has to become physical, or take on partly a physical nature in order for us to sort of fuse together. Yeah, so they call this theosis or divinization. It sounds almost heretical in itself, but this is the normal view of the Eastern Orthodox Church, that we will share in God's form of existence. We won't become God, but we will share in God's form of existence. Okay, but I'm not a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Where I depart from them is this limited power stuff. So I have to tell you now, how I extend God's powers to account for this. And I'm going to give two extensions of God's powers. So the first, to account for what I've just said, is the following posit: that God is able to unify an aspect of themselves, either the Logos, with an aspect of physical reality, such as a human embryo. So I suggest that ascribing this power to God can explain how the incarnation happens in something like the traditional Christian sense. I'm not being particularly heretical at this point. Maybe the virgin birth I'm not keen on, but anyway, mumble at that point in the creed. Anyway, okay. I mean, the other thing that stopped me, so I was already, when I heard about this form of Christianity, it was finding very attractive, but I had issues with the resurrection. I think one worry is it seems to return us to the problem of evil again, right? My explanation of why evil does happen is that God can't stop it. But if God can raise people from the dead, it's like, why don't you do that more often, God? Could, prevent a lot of pain here. Okay, so I'm influenced very much here by the work of Dale Allison. And in the light of that, my proposal is what I call the identity theory, that the resurrection and the ascension are the same event. So we're rejecting what we see in Luke's gospel, the more familiar idea that Jesus rises again, hangs around for a bit, and then floats up to heaven. The claim is rather the moment of the resurrection is the same moment Jesus returns to the being he called Father. And actually, this isn't like something I've just made up. It's Dale Allison shows how it's been a fairly prominent view among 20th century New Testament scholars that the early Christians believed this, and that the Luke's gospel stuff was a later development. Anyway, okay, so how do I expand God's powers to account for this? This is my second and final expansion of God's powers. The claim is that God is able to reabsorb the Logos with its physical nature. So God is able to fuse an aspect of God with an aspect of physical reality, and then is later able to sort of reabsorb that now with its physical nature. And that's what I call the resurrection. And the thought is that's the point at which salvation is achieved, because that's the point in which God as a whole takes on a physical nature. Okay, but how did, if Jesus wasn't kind of trotting around, eating fish and stuff, how did people know about this resurrection? Well, here I adopt the view that the first resurrection experiences were visionary experiences, maybe a little bit like how we think of Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. So I think we should think of the first Easter Sunday as, the early Christians, first Mary Magdalene and then Peter and then the disciple getting thrown to the ground and having these wild visions. Okay, but then how does God bring about these visions, right? Do I have to expand God's powers again? Well, no, my hypothesis is that Jesus, during his normal ministry, prepped his followers to prep them to undergo theosis when it became possible and to comprehend its metaphysical underpinnings. So at the moment, this radical change in reality, looking for the word there, reality, where God takes on this physical nature, which makes it possible for us to become one with God. At that moment, because of this prepping, the first Christians partly become one with God and have these radically profound new experiences of the divine. And it's these visions that kickstart Christianity. Okay, very finally, why take any of this seriously? Remember, I'm just trying to show it's a credible possibility, but why even think that? I mean, primarily it's something to do with, I think this gives a good explanation of Christian origins, which are, I think, a little bit weird and hard to explain. So I take to be a historical datum here that lots of people, we can perhaps argue about how many, but anyway, lots of people had experiences that persuaded them that Jesus was alive again and motivated them to spend decades vigorously defending this conviction against violent opposition. I think the best naturalistic explanation of this is that Peter and Mary Magdalene had grief hallucinations, and then some kind of groupthink caused others to hallucinate something similar. But I think this is I think it's the best naturalistic explanation, but it's a little bit of an unsatisfying explanation for various reasons. Grief hallucinations are quite common. They don't tend to get people to believe the person is alive again. If anything, they get them to believe they've gone to a more peaceful place. It's hard to make sense of, I think, groupthink causing hallucinations. What makes a lot more sense is groupthink, and I think is more normal in kind of cults and religions and so on, is groupthink causing belief. One person has the hallucinations maybe and they cause belief. It's a bit weird, a little bit less expected. Hard. You wouldn't expect it to cause actual other people to have hallucinations. And the thing that's hardest for me, I think, is that this kind of stuff would provoke such a vigorous and sustained defense of this stuff. I mean, I think what would make more sense is if, and I think this is what tended to happen in my understanding with these messianic sects of the time, you get a new Messiah at some point. Maybe Peter has a vision, said, I'm the new Messiah now. I think you'd expect that. You wouldn't expect this sort of continuous, sustained focus on, on this one thing, Jesus focus kind of thing. Okay. However, important point. I think atheists should believe this, right? I'm not a Christian apologist who says, this should convince atheists should go for this, right? Why? Because when you're doing probabilistic reasoning, you've got to think about two things: how well your hypothesis accounts for the data, but also prior probability, right? How, as it were, for people who don't know about this, kind of intrinsically plausible hypotheses. And if you're from an atheist worldview, this resurrection stuff has such a low prior that even once you plug in the boost of the evidence, it's still going to have a very low probability at the end of it.
Sorry,
I think
if I could,
yeah.
I mean, I just want to ask a clarifying question about what you just said. So, when you said that atheists should believe this, you mean that atheists should believe what you called the best naturalistic explanation, that Peter and Mary Magdalene had grief hallucinations? Yeah, okay.
Yes, right. sorry, that was a bit unclear, wasn't it? Not that they should believe in it. I think they should. I think this naturalistic is a bit unsatisfying, but they should say, slightly improbable things happen sometimes. This is probably our best guess as to what happened. And so this is why it's important, I think, for a lot of the criticism you made was saying, it's like believing in aliens or, Elvis being back and stuff. I'm like on your side with that. I think we don't go for those things because they're low evidence. They're low priors. And likewise, an atheist should say there's too low a prior for this evidence to get you anywhere. Having said that, I do think this is fairly significant evidence. And some of the comparisons you were making to Greek mythology about, reporting that people thought animals talked and stuff. I think this was dancing. I mean, to me, that is an absurd comparison. And I think any expert on New Testament stuff, I'm not an expert, but even non-Christian experts like Bart Ehrman and James Crossley and stuff, I just think that is just a ridiculous comparison because this is much more significant evidence, largely because of the letters of Paul, which are, gold dust by the standards of ancient history. Paul was writing 25 years later. He didn't know Jesus, but he knew Peter. He spent 15 days with Peter. He knew James, the brother of Jesus, met Peter and James twice, knew John, one of the 12. This is pretty, it's very, very different to just reporting mythology. And this is why atheist New Testament scholars tend to believe that these experiences actually happen. I suspect what was going on in your video is, I think it's psychologically that, I shouldn't psychoanalyze, should you? I think it is hard to, if you just think this resurrection stuff is so implausible and has such a low prior, and that, that can be a rational thing to think, then it's hard to bracket that and say, but is this strong evidence? But I think that's what you have to do. So I would say this is pretty strong evidence. Put it this way, if this were a mundane event, it would be a no-brainer that it happened, right? So it is significant evidence, but still a lot hangs on the prior. Okay, sorry, I'm going to try and speed up. I don't want to go on too long.
Yeah, because we've got about 20 minutes already. So if we can wrap it up.
Okay, very quickly. I'll just be a few more minutes. So why take this seriously? Basically, I think what I've offered is a much more satisfying explanation of the evidence in the Bayesian sense that the hypothesis makes the evidence expected. If they really did have these radically new experiences of the divine through partial unification of the divine, that would make probable the historical data I said. And why does this have a good prior probability? So what it hangs on is, does this have a reasonable prior? And I think if you believe in a God of limited powers, this should have a reasonable prior, because it's a fairly simple extension of God's powers. And I think at these levels of fundamental ontology, I think simplicity is the key factor in shaping the priors. Like in fundamental physics, if you've got a simple story and you're thinking about a slight extension, you'd give that a reasonable prior. I think if you believe in a God of limited powers, you should think about this the same. It feels like it's different, but I think, again, that's sort of cultural reasons. We should be thinking about simplicity. And also, if you're thinking about, if you think God had created the world for a reason, if God of limited powers, it might be this is it. This is all God can do. But it might be there's more to, there's some other intention God had. We need to give a reasonable prior to that. So basically, I think this is a good explanation of the evidence, and it has a reasonable prior. Very, very, very quickly, I just wanted to say at the end, because you were baffled about what I said on this final point. This is the final thing you raised, and I was baffled at your bafflement. That this evidence that Jesus was an extraordinary moral teacher of a very rare kind, which I think doesn't prove anything in itself, but is significant in the mix. And you seem to be taking me to think it improves Christianity, and I think I was clear that wasn't the case. Does it raise the probability? Here's what you have to ask if you understand, which you do. I'm just talking to an audience, how Bayesian reasoning works. Pick someone random off the street. How likely is it that they're an extraordinary moral teacher of a very rare kind? Pretty improbable. But then add, actually, they're God incarnate. How likely is it then? Surely that raises the probability. That is all you need for there to be evidence. And Alex was, this is the very final point. Alex was baffled that, if it doesn't prove it, how can it lend credibility? It's a very familiar point in Bayesian reasoning that if two independent pieces of evidence point in the same direction, they are multiplied together. So two, small bits of evidence can quickly get very big. The suspect was at the same place as the murder, was wearing what the murderer was wearing. In and of themselves might not be important, but can be pretty conclusive when brought together. So I think, very last sentence, this is a good explanation of the origins of Christianity. There's these two things that support the truth that are independent or more or less independent, point in the same direction. You shouldn't believe it if you're an atheist, because your prior will be too low. But if you're convinced by the evidence that there is a God of limited powers, which I think you should be, the prior is enough for this to be a credible possibility. Sorry, that was a bit too long. That's it.
No worries. Thank you so much, Philip, for the presentation. What I want to do now is go through some of the issues. We probably won't get through them all, but some of the issues point by point. So I want to talk about fine-tuning, because obviously you think that's a good argument for God and we don't. Then if we grant that, does a God of limited powers, is that a good solution? Does that make sense? Then, maybe why Christianity? And then we can talk about some of the Jesus stuff if we have time. So, Alex, why don't you kick us off with some of your objections to fine-tuning, and then we can let Philip respond, and then we'll get down with his objections. Why don't we take it from there?
Okay, so, I was hoping I could ask about the kind of relation between the limited God and fine-tuning. So, if we run the fine-tuning argument with this different theological model, right? And I think what I want to probe a bit more on is this worry I have that, okay, so I think there's two things. One of them is that, I think I can understand there being independent lines of reasoning that have been given over the years for a kind of perfect being, kind of all-powerful God. It's a kind of traditional picture of God. So something like ontological argument, for instance. I don't know that I can put my finger on quite so obviously a priori reasons for thinking that there's a limited God, right? So I wonder if there are any, for one thing, because if not, it seems like a different status, at least, to the kind of traditional God that has these arguments that bolster it. And I think the second point related to that is, if we start thinking about it probabilistically, forget about the a priori stuff for a moment, the type of hypothesis that it is seems like an umbrella to begin with, because God of limited abilities doesn't tell you how much abilities he has, and there's a big range of things. All we're doing is knocking out that one where he's got unlimited power. That leaves, everything. Atheism's off the table. Perfect being theology is off the table, but there's a lot of things that are still on the table there. So presumably the idea is supposed to be that we're narrowing down the limited God variations, because the ones where he's not powerful enough to set the laws of physics, there's no point including those. They're not part of, that you're not interested in them. And the ones where he'd be so powerful he could eradicate all suffering, right? That's going to be off the table as well. So it's kind of like in the middle somehow. So it's a relatively narrow range of what seems to me a very large possible range. It just kind of looks like the fine-tuning problem again, right? Like I could start telling you, I could intuition pump you by saying, it's really hard to see how, when we say all power, we don't mean a finite amount of power. I mean, you could think that, but maybe there's some finite limit of the amount of power you can have, and it's just, it's 100 units of power, and it's not 101 or something. But I think most people, when they're talking about omnipotence, they mean something like God can do anything, right? Like it's unlimited, his power. So doesn't that just mean that the range is actually infinitely big, and what you're doing is talking about a finite subsection of that? And then isn't it just straightforward that it's almost infinitesimally small as a proportion of that range? And doesn't that just make it incredibly unlikely that by chance, in the epistemic sense, because I don't, God in theory, for all I know, could have any amount of power. for it to land in that kind of sweet spot where he's got just enough to make, to work in fine tuning, but not so much that it undermines the problem. It just seems to me that there's a fine tuning problem. So I think that was my two problems. It was one, I don't know if there's any a priori reason to think that God has just that much power. And isn't it just like a super ad hoc, sort of fine-tuned hypothesis?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That's very interesting. On the first, I don't think there are any a priori arguments for a God of limited power. I don't think there are any a priori arguments for any kind of God. If I believe the ontological argument, like my friend and colleague Jack Symes is tempted to, although he's agnostic, then this would be a very different matter. But I don't think any of those arguments fail. I think we're just trying to account for the data.
You said fail, Philip. I think you mean you don't think any of them work.
Oh yes, I did. Sorry. I don't think any of them work. So we're just accounting for the data. For example, fine tuning. On your second point, I don't think it's correct to say this is. You're trying to, I think, make the comparison to the fine tuning situation, and I don't think it's anything like that. So I want to make 2 points. Firstly, I don't think it's anything like that. I mean, why are we interested in fine tuning? Because it makes this Bayesian argument for God, right? Because, well, the argument is, for better or worse, on chance, on atheism, it's improbable that you'd get those values of the constants. On theism, it's more probable. So I don't think you're trying to say something like that is going on here, that this sort of favors some hypothesis over some other, some meta God or something, or maybe you are. What you're saying is, okay, it's something very precise, that he's got precisely these powers and not those. Well, why is that different to like the speed of light having this precise value, of any value it could have had? We don't say the speed of light is fine-tuned. We just say it's got this precise value, and that's a cost in terms of simplicity, right? It would be, Richard Swinburne says, I'd take as well, I don't know if he's right, that we used to think the speed of light is infinite because that's a simpler value. And then we get evidence to the contrary, and we go for this finite range. And I suppose I think of it similar with God of limited powers. I do think that the all-powerful God is simpler, but it doesn't fit the data. Just like an infinite speed of light doesn't fit the data. With the speed of light, we don't tie ourselves up in knots trying to sort of keep it infinite. We just say, well, that fits the data better. So I suppose I'll put back to you, why is this different to the speed of light being this precise range? God has these powers and doesn't have other powers.
I guess. I mean, I'm not sure that the two hypotheses seem very different empirically. I mean, like there's really strong empirical evidence for the speed of light being what it is and not a different value. And that's why we came to accept
I think
it being that way.
I think the strong empirical evidence for this based on fine tuning.
But not the same type of
difference.
Well, make a prediction. Make a risky prediction then, like Einstein did.
Okay. No, it's the same in the sense of a Bayesian case built on evidence. Yeah, it's not the same in the sense that I don't know what predictions would come out of this or something, but there are cases in science where we can't make predictions, often with ancient history, or if you're thinking about the case for evolution, or the case many scientists make for inflation in the early universe. It's harder to say what the prediction. It's nice when you can have predictions, but you can have an evidential Bayesian empirical case without predictions.
Sure, I agree. Yeah. But I'm just saying the difference between those two hypotheses in particular. One of them makes risky predictions. This one doesn't. Right?
That is a relevant difference. It's not a relevant difference for the point. You're trying to make. The point you're trying to make is nothing to do with the speed of light, predictions and stuff. It's that. Oh, it's exactly, God has exactly these powers. Isn't that incredibly improbable? But why doesn't that carry over to the speed of light? It has exactly this value, all the values it could have had. How can you take that seriously, that hypothesis?
But I mean, on the basic point, you just concede that it is quite unlikely, epistemically, looking at it, that it would fall in that narrow range and not outside on either side. That is intrinsically unlikely, isn't it?
It's simpler than physics. It's simpler than physics. So how can we say this is? I think we judge the prior probability, which is what we're talking about, on simplicity grounds, and it's simpler than physics. Let me say that a bit more precisely. The limitations of God are simpler than physics. So no one says, "Oh my God!" I mean, we try to get physics simpler, right? We'd like to get it simpler, but no one's, it's pretty damn simple, and so by analogy, I think we shouldn't have this concern if my account of God's limitations is simpler than physics.
I want to bring Dan in here. Dan, do you want to comment on this debate? And then I do want to talk just about fine-tuning itself, whether that's good evidence for God, because we haven't done that yet. I think Alex's argument sort of concedes that issue. But Dan, talk a little bit about what you think of Alex's argument, and do you agree? Is there another way you might consider Philip's argument?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. First of all, I just want to say that I'm a big fan of some of your work. The book Galileo's Error was a fantastic book. But then on this particular debate, I think.
But I knew there was a but there.
Right. So, with the case of light, it is a priori quite improbable that light would have one specific value as opposed to another. The reason that the finite speed of light doesn't take a big hit, I take it, is that by the time people had measured the speed of light, we had a lot of independent data on light. And it was, not just that we have independent scientific data, we have ordinary experience with light, right? It's a fact that everyone accepts that light exists. And then there's a further hypothesis about what exactly the features of light are. A priori that it has one particular speed as opposed to any other is I take it, improbable. But then when you have a large confluence of different observations that confirm that it has that particular speed, both observations you can make astronomically, observations you can make in the laboratory, and then eventually it becomes a fruitful hypothesis because it for the way that it enters into Maxwell's electrodynamics, that it comes out as a prediction of that theory that is then independently confirmed using non-optical experiments. The speed of light has the value that it has. I think that has a different kind of status than a hypothesis about a deity that's whose powers just somehow are precisely those powers to fine-tune these constants, but not the power to prevent either small evils, like the evil of the pain you feel when you stub your toe, or the tremendous evil of something like the Holocaust or mass extinction.
So look, I'm not saying, this is better proven than, any other scientific hypothesis. And yeah, with other scientific hypotheses, you can make predictions and get them confirmed, and that may be stronger support. But look, I mean, imagine we just had one experiment to show the speed of light. We had one experimental source. No one would say, I mean, yeah, you'd want more sources, but no one would say, it can't. It's so improbable that it has exactly that value of all, you go.
I think that is what we would. I think that is potentially what we would say. I mean, it depends on the details of the experiment and how. So, for instance, take an experiment where there was an apparent observation of something that people considered a priori, or they considered unlikely before performing the experiment, right? So there was an experiment several years ago now where it looked like there were neutrinos that were moving faster than light that came out of CERN. The response of the scientific community was not to say, oh, well, now we have to give up on Einstein's relativity because we see that this experiment shows that there are particles with speed faster than light. Rather, what they said was, no, we should wait for more data to come out. It would be premature to make a conclusion at this stage. If we had when you perform an experiment and you find an outcome that you otherwise thought was unlikely, the right response is to withhold judgment, I think, as opposed to
just to point out, Jim Al-Khalili said that he's a physicist in the UK, quite famous. He said he would eat his underpants live on TV if that experiment held up. So that was the kind of attitude I think you're looking at, Dan. Right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good analogy, because that was overturning a very well established scientific theory. Yes, of course we should be cautious there, but I don't think people were saying, look, you're sort of at the end of your first point, you sort of mocking. He said, oh, he's got exactly these powers and none of. I don't think people were saying we're sort of casting doubt on the speed of light, saying, oh, it has exactly that value and no others. How implausible. No, you want some evidential support and you want to test that. But I just think that there's a false comparison here that you
Alex, you want to say something?
We're just very quickly. I mean, and I do think you're coming back to this, what I think is false thing, that this level of power and not that much, like all power is on this exact metric. And just very quickly, I mean, I do think there is strong evidence for the fine tuning. I think these probabilities are incredibly strong. So even if you're right that this cast, anyway, go on.
Alex, you want to come back on that, and then I want to go to this issue, because obviously that is one of the things that divides us. We don't think it's very strong. So Alex, say what you want to say, and then I want to go on to fine tuning.
I just wanted to clarify. I think maybe my point wasn't well made, maybe my side. But I think all I was trying to do is, like, for instance, when you asked Dan, is it a priori unlikely the speed of light would have this exact value? He just said, yes, it is a priori unlikely. And that's all I'm saying, is that in this hypothesis, I think you just have to go into it saying it is a priori unlikely hypothesis. So before looking at the evidence, I'm just thinking, God could, if we're entertaining limited God hypotheses, there's a broad range that it could occupy. Your hypothesis, the success of this argument requires that it doesn't occupy most of the range, and thereby it's unlikely. I mean, it just seems to me it's not very much controversial about that.
I mean, I suppose in a sense that any hypothesis about fundamental reality is incredibly improbable because of all the bloody ways the universe might have been. Okay, so that doesn't stop.
That's right.
And it's less than the speed of light case now I think about it, because speed of light, it's like could have had this value, could have had this value, could have had this value. When I'm saying, I suppose the structure of physics could have been, the structure of physics could have been right. But look, in that sense in which any fundamental theory is incredibly improbable, fine. But I thought we were identifying something particularly problematic.
If you recall, I was also bringing up the issue of having independent a priori support, just to contrast it with, the equally intrinsically unlikely idea that God just occupies the maximum value, because that's just as unlikely as occupying any other value. The difference being, at least people have a priori arguments that make you think that he does. But in this case, it's just the same as any specific hypothesis. It's intrinsically unlikely, but it doesn't also have those even supporting arguments to make you think that it's true. That's what I thought was the difference.
It's more like what we find with physics, right? You don't have a priori truth. You just got to go off the evidence.
Okay.
All right, so let's move on. I want to talk about fine tuning and whether we think this is this big, leap in probability for God. So Dan, why don't you, we're obviously not going to, in the whole conversation, we're only going to do a little fraction of the fine tuning argument. So obviously we're not going to cover all the objections, but I want to pick your favorite objection and then we're going to put it to Philip and we can have a little bit of back and forth.
Yeah. So I think what might be the most useful way to put the way that I think about the fine tuning issue is to examine the fine tuning of a particular constant. So let's think about what's usually considered the best example of the cosmological constant. There's this calculation that's supposed to show that the value of the cosmological constant that you need for the existence of life is something like 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the value that you expect on the hypothesis. But look, we have to be very careful about what different communities mean by fine tuning. So often, what philosophers mean by fine tuning is not what physicists often mean by fine tuning. Often, philosophers mean by fine tuning is what they take to be a datum about the world. That there are various constants that if they didn't have the values they had, if they had slightly different values, then then life wouldn't be possible. And this is supposed to be true about, for example, the cosmological constant, that if the cosmological constants were much larger or if it were much smaller, then the universe would either rapidly spread apart or collapse on itself before you get the existence of galaxies or living things or anything like that. But when physicists have talked about the cosmological constant, that's not at all what they've meant. What physicists have meant, by and large, with a couple of exceptions, is that the theory that we have that says that the most probable value of the cosmological constant is 20 orders of magnitude different than the observed value is a bad theory. So that theory is the theory that the cosmological constant is the vacuum energy. And if you use quantum field theory to calculate the most probable value of the vacuum energy, you find a value that's 20 orders of magnitude larger. Sorry, 120.
So 120. It's 120.
Yes. I keep saying 20. 120 orders of magnitude larger than the observed value. And what that indicates to me is that we don't have a good theory of the cosmological constant. If we don't have a good theory of the cosmological constant, I don't see why we would then conclude that the cosmological constant is fine-tuned in the sense that philosophers mean. And that, it seems to me, is the sense that you need for your argument, right? So I don't think it is a datum that the universe is fine-tuned with respect to the cosmological constant.
Can I just add one very quick thing about that, actually, because we've got some new results coming out, and they'll probably be out by the time we broadcast. Well, they will definitely be out by the time we broadcast this video, because I've actually recorded the results, and I know what they are. I can't tell you what they are, but what I can tell you is the first year is. So basically, you know, when we've had this little conversation, if you like, about what Alan Guth said about the fine-tuning of the cosmological constant. And he said, if we're right that it's a constant, that it's a vacuum energy, then it's fine-tuned. But of course, there's an alternative view that it's not the vacuum energy, that it's a scalar field that changes over time.
Right.
Then that justification for these 120 order magnitudes seems to go away. And there's results from DESI, the dark energy spectroscopic instrument. The first year results seem to show that it better fits the data than that it's actually changing over time. And the 3-year results are about to be released. In fact, will be released probably by the time we put this out. And we shall see whether they confirm that it's more like a changing field and not a cosmological constant. So I just want to throw that in the mix. And Philip, feel free to reply to what Dan said.
Yeah, well, I was speaking to some physicists about this stuff recently who were talking about this as well at a physics conference, a conference on dark energy. Well, I think there is something, as you say, quite distinctive about this one case of fine tuning, and there are many cases of alleged fine tuning in our current theories. But about this one case, I would have put it that there's two things, right? There's one thing. It doesn't seem to be the most natural value if you think of it as the energy of the vacuum. It doesn't seem to be the most natural value. That it's this incredibly small but non-zero, and that's baffling why it is that way. But I mean, I wouldn't have called that the fine tuning. I mean, I don't know. We'll have to. I don't want to get too into semantics, and we'd have to. I mean, I increasingly engage with physicists on this. Graham White from Southampton, Luke Barnes, and Geraint Lewis were over for a conference I had recently. I wouldn't have thought they'd say that was meant it was fine tuned, that it doesn't have the expected value. Fine tuning. My sense is that from engaging with physicists that it's has to fall in a narrow range for such and such. If it's fine tuned for life, it has to fall in a certain narrow range. So I would say it's my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected on this. Graham White said actually I could do Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and phone a friend during this, but I don't think that would be practical. That it's unexpected, but also the value it is fine tuned. I mean, I'm interested actually what Phil said. Why would it remove that latter case of fine tuning?
So my understanding is that, and Dan, correct me if I get this wrong, but this justification for the 120 orders magnitude, it's not that you couldn't change the cosmological constant at the 120th decimal place. You obviously could, right? You could halve it, life would still be fine. You could make it 10 times bigger. I think it could be, 100 times bigger. Life is this 120 orders of magnitude is because that's the value of what is considered. If you calculate it from quantum field theory and you assume it's this vacuum energy, then you get this giant discrepancy, and that's where you get this giant number. But if it's not the vacuum energy, then you don't get this giant number. In fact, it is, it's a field slowly rolling down a hill or something. Then it's not surprising at all. Would you think that's right, Dan?
I haven't seen these new results, so I'm not familiar with what they're doing. But there's more generally, we can distinguish a few different hypotheses about the cosmological constant. So there's, first of all, the hypothesis that it's just the vacuum energy, and that's it. And that's the hypothesis that poorly predicts the observed value, right? What's called the worst prediction in the history of physics. You could then postulate that perhaps there's two effects that somehow cancel each other out, and you wouldn't expect them to cancel each other out so precisely. That's where the idea comes in, then maybe there's something finely tuned, that the cancellation has to be so precise that it's 120 orders of magnitude, but not all the way to zero. How could that be? But then there's another hypothesis you could have. You could have the hypothesis that, for example, maybe it was just wrong in the first place to think that the vacuum energy gravitates, and then it's just wrong to think that there's any relationship between the vacuum energy and the cosmological constant. Then it's not that they're canceling each other out, but rather that there's some other kind of phenomena, maybe one that we don't have a theory of yet, and it could be that that this other theory postulates, for example, a scalar field, and that scalar field gravitates, and then for reasons that we would understand if we had this other theory, you'd see why it would gravitate to the level that it does. Right. So those are three different hypotheses about what the cosmological constant could be. And notice that you only find something finely tuned on one of those hypotheses and not on the other. Now you can rule out the one where it's just the vacuum energy, right? But you have the hypothesis there that you have this careful balancing between two effects, and then you have also the hypothesis that there's just some other phenomena that we don't understand yet.
Yeah, so I see now, if we're thinking of it as the vacuum energy, and then there has to be something that cuts it down, then I see there's another fine-tuning point. Oh, it got it exactly nearly zero, but not zero. I see that but I would have thought it's still the more familiar kind of fine-tuning that for life to be possible, it has to be in the relevant units. It has to be very, very small, but not less than zero. And so I appreciate.
Well, it can be less than zero.
It can be less than zero, just not
can be less than zero.
enormously negative. In fact, Don Page, hang on one second. Don Page wrote an article saying slightly negative cosmology would be better for life.
Okay.
Because then you'd have like maybe a cyclic universe or something.
So here's what Weinberg's original argument was. Right. So Weinberg points out that you wouldn't a priori have expected this careful balancing between two different effects, like one known effect, like the vacuum energy, very carefully balancing with one unknown effect. You wouldn't maybe expect that. But suppose that whatever the effect is that balances with the vacuum energy, that cancels out with it, can vary from one region of physical reality to another. Then you would expect to find yourself in the region where you have the least amount of cancellation that's still compatible with your own existence. And so what Weinberg thought we then predicted was that the cosmological constant should have the largest value compatible with our existence. And that's what made people set up and take the relationship between the multiverse and fine-tuning seriously. Now, people had other reasons to invoke multiverses, but that was a really important prediction for the multiverse hypothesis, that if you have some kind of multiverse where whatever effect it is that cancels with the cosmological constant can vary from one region to another, then you expect to find yourself in the region that has the least amount of cancellation.
Yeah, so it still seems to me, and there's a couple of things going on here. That is it the vacuum energy, and there's a problem with that, or is it something else? But still, the point that it has to be in this fairly narrow range for life to be possible is what's relevant for this argument. And is that not somewhat independent of this? But also, I just want to say, just before you answer that, I mean, look, this is one case, and of course we want, we want to leave it to physicists to debate this, and it's an ongoing thing. And the fine tuning might go away tomorrow, or there might be more fine tuning. And I often find talking to physicists, I find the most common response is, "Oh, it'll go away," but all we can ever do is work with the evidence we currently have, with due humility that it might change. I think it's a definition of a bias to say, "Oh, I'm going to wait for the evidence to change," before.
No, but that's not just
let you have one more say, and then I've got one other thing I want to talk about fine tuning, and then maybe we'll move on to the next topic, unless Alex wants to say something about fine tuning. Dan, go ahead.
So look, you're still assuming what I've called the philosopher's conception of fine tuning. and not really paying attention to the way that physicists use the phrase fine-tuning. For a physicist, fine-tuning is not a datum, it's a feature of a theory. And a theory is fine-tuned if in a way that can be made more precise, the theory poorly predicts a measured value. Or in other words, to put it in terms of naturalness, that the values that some free parameters have are unnatural values. And then what physicists expect is that when you have some flaw in a theory, we would like to replace the theory with a theory that doesn't have that flaw. Now, theists can play the same game right alongside. So a theist can say, hey, look, if I posit God, then these values, then we have a hypothesis that's no longer fine-tuned. But what I don't think that we should get into the habit of doing is saying that that we know that some parameter is fine-tuned in the philosopher's sense, because it's precisely the areas of physical theory that we understand the least and that we have the least confidence in, where fine-tuning shows up.
Can I reply to
that?
that?
Go for it.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Well, I do speak to a lot of physicists on this increasingly. Where me and Graham, who I mentioned earlier, have formed a group of philosophers and physicists collaborating on this stuff. And look, I mean, I think what you're doing there is slipping in a little bit of philosophy of science. Maybe it's a bit of philosophy of science that's common among certain physicists. I don't think it's universal. I mean, I suppose how I would put it is, look, yes, of course, we're just talking about our current theories, and we know they will change. But I put it like, I mean, if we're talking about, for example, the fine-tuning of the mass of electrons, right? The fine-tuning of the mass of electrons, the thought would be electrons, according to our current theories, electrons do have that particular mass, and they needed to have mass in very narrow range for life to be possible. And that's all you need for the argument to take place. And so I don't see why anything like that is I agree. You're pointing to the very particular place of the cosmological constant. There's also reason to think, hold on, how we're thinking about this is not what you'd expect. But I don't think that occurs. I don't think that occurs in all cases of fine tuning, and so I don't see how what you've just said undermines, for example, fine tuning from the mass of the electron.
Okay, so I want to put a different line of attack on the fine tuning argument here, and I'll be quite brief. But basically, it's a topic that never gets raised in these fine-tuning conversations, so it kind of frustrates me. And that is the idea of a Darwinian solution, because in a way, we've seen this problem before. Like if you took the genes randomly, you shuffled them randomly, you're not going to get a functional organism. The idea is not that there was a designer, but rather there's a non-natural mechanism to select the constants. And Smolin has suggested a mechanism how this could be done through cosmological natural selection. So black holes give birth to new universes. They inherit the constants of their sort of parents, but with a slight change. And they select for new universes because, universes with stars would give rise to more black holes. Now, what I find interesting why I find this more plausible, I mean, it's not actually my favorite attack on the fine-tuning argument, but it's the one that I want to raise because nobody else does. And two reasons why I think it's more plausible. One, it's worked before. It worked for Darwinian natural selection, and it's, in a way, the same problem. And the second is that it actually has some plausibility from quantum gravity. So there's a theory called causal set theory, which actually predicted the value of the cosmological constant. Like everyone talks about Weinberg's prediction in the late 1980s. 10 years before the cosmological constant was observed. But Raphael Sorkin also predicted the cosmological constant would be very small based on causal set theory. And Stav Zalel and Faye Dowker published a paper saying there's a link between causal set theory and cosmological natural selection. So given that actually, the God theory hasn't predicted anything as far as I know. So this looks, it's still speculative. There's lots of issues with it, and I certainly don't want to sort of escalate it to some sort of confirmed theory. It's very far from that. But it certainly looks better for those two reasons than the God theory. So what do you have to say about that, Philip?
Yeah, I like Lee Smolin a lot. I wanted to talk about this in my white book actually, but I sort of ran out of pages and was trying to keep it small. But yeah, it's it's a fascinating theory, and I certainly wouldn't want to rule it out. And I suppose the issue with this is I just find physicists have big problems with it. And one way of saying that is it's what is it, 30, 40 years old, and there's only like 130 citations to it, and every time I have spoken.
Yeah, it hasn't got a lot of attention. That's just true.
And I'm
hang on, I'll just say one thing, Philip.
Yeah.
We did a survey of physicists. Actually, it's not come out yet. but it's sitting on my colleague Niash Ashford. We wrote the book Battle of the Big Bang together. It's sitting on his desk, and I'm hoping we're going to release it very, very soon. But we surveyed them on different explanations for fine-tuning, and the God was the least popular, and cosmological and natural selection was certainly more popular. Brute facts was the most popular. But it's certainly more popular than the God selection. So if we're competing with God, the fact that physicists don't take it that seriously is just not a problem.
Referring to that survey without releasing it makes you the Gary Habermas of atheism.
It's coming. We're hoping it's going to come out this week. Actually, it is sitting on Niash's desk, and as soon as he's ready to hit the upload button on archive, it will be up.
Oh, I look forward to looking at that. Well, look, see, this is in terms of these criticisms that physicists have of Smolin's theory. I mean, it's sort of outside of my skill set. I want physicists to debate that, but there do seem to be, every time I've spoken to somebody, there are some deep concerns with this theory. Just on the other point, it's obviously better than God because look, I think there are big cultural reasons that the God hypothesis. I feel silly. It took me a long time to build up the confidence to talk about this book. The Why book, because I do still feel silly talking about it among my colleagues, and I think there are real cultural biases here. I think if we could get into that, but I mean, I suppose I would want to know, well, why do you think it's a better theory than the God one? I think what I described, I would say, is a fairly simple hypothesis that I would say accounts for. Obviously, we can debate that, but I just think I would say it's cultural reasons that. People just think, God's obviously stupid, isn't it? Obviously, we ruled that out. And I think that's just cultural reasons rather than rationally assessing the hypothesis.
Alex, anything you want to say on fine-tuning, or should we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, we are massively over time already, so I'll shut up, certainly.
Okay, all right. Well, let's go to the next topic, which is why Christianity then? Why not deism or Gnosticism or something else? Dan, no, Alex, why don't you kick us off on that? What are your thoughts on that, and then get to respond?
Maybe we can talk about the participatory theory then for a moment, if that's okay. So,
well, actually, before we do, maybe then I'm going to push that, because to me, I know deism seems much better fit. In deism, you've got this idea that God can set up the universe, but then he never intervenes. And the problem I have with a God of limited power, and then connecting it to Christianity, is that the Christian God intervenes. He does lots of miracles, not just raising Jesus from the dead, the Exodus. It depends which ones you believe in. Some you might think are not literal, the flood maybe, but he certainly does, the 10 plagues. There's lots of interventions that God does. It seems like a deist would be a much better fit, because in deism you could explain the fine-tuning. Maybe they can set up the universe and then they can't interfere with it. But a God that interferes with the universe like the Christian God does, just to me doesn't seem any kind of fit to what you're suggesting. So why not deism? Or Gnosticism would be another one, because the Gnostics believed, maybe not everyone knows about Gnosticism, but the Gnostics believed that there was an evil demiurge that created the universe. It wasn't the ultimate God. And that was a bad thing, creating the universe, because we could then be physical and we suffer in our physical bodies, and we should be spiritual beings. So it seemed like Gnosticism or deism would seem like a much better fit, wouldn't it? Why Christianity?
Well, I don't believe those miracles happened, especially not the Old Testament ones. And the view I'm defending is very close to deism. I think if you just had the fine tuning, it would be deism. This is, I suppose, a God that has very limited powers of intervention. Basically, all they can do is kick off a universe with the right numbers to evolve life. But then what they can do is start to be more intimately involved with the universe once it's at a sufficiently evolved state. So it's just a little bit of a departure. I would say it's a simple departure from basic deism. And I just add again, I keep coming back to this because I think so often in these debates we get back in, as though either side is trying to definitely prove something. All I'm arguing is that this is a credible possibility, and it's in not, so maybe Smolin's view is a possibility as well. Maybe Gnosticism, I always say Gnosticism is a possibility as well, like Alex O'Connor was trying to press on me. But all I need is it's a credible possibility to put my trust in this spiritual practice, which I've found, coming back to the Eastern Orthodox stuff, makes sense of a lot of my deepest experiences, and is, it's rational for me. That gives me further rationality to more deeply engage with this and trust with this and so on. So that's my answer.
All right, Dan, do you have anything you want to say on this topic? Otherwise, we're going to go to Alex on the atonement.
I do. So, and actually, maybe this nicely dovetails with what Alex is going to say about the atonement. I'm not sure. But so one of the things that I do in my intro philosophy class is that, and this isn't something that's typically done in intro philosophy class, is that I include some novels. So we read Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol, which nicely has this epistemic question that's addressed right in the beginning of that novel, right? So Scrooge is sitting in his apartment, and Marley comes into the door, and at first Scrooge thinks that he's hallucinating, right? He thinks that he's had food poisoning, and so he thinks that most likely he's hallucinating. And then Marley makes a bunch of noise and so on and so forth, and Scrooge comes to believe that he's really being visited by his dead business partner. Now, one of the questions that I raise with students is something like this: is like, well, was that a particularly good reason for Scrooge to change his mind? And of course, I don't tell them this, but I think the answer is no, you shouldn't change just because this entity made a loud noise. Maybe there's other reasons why Scrooge should change his mind. But I think that even if you believe that there are ghosts, one thing you're going to think is that ghosts are, given all the other data we have about our world, ghosts are more rare than our incidence of food poisoning. And likewise, I think that even if you believe that there's a God of any sort, then you're going to have a relatively low prior that one particular person was the incarnation of that being on Earth. So I don't think it's just atheists that should begin with a low prior there. I think just as the ghost believer should begin with a low prior that Marley is an actual ghost, so too the theist should begin with a low prior that any particular person like Jesus is the incarnation of a deity in the earthly realm.
Philip?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the way I think, but I start from a God of limited powers. I'm much more confident in that than I am in Christianity, right? But then, so you're in this mindset, you've got to kind of get in that foundational mindset that God's created the world for a reason. What is that reason? It could be that this is it, right? This is all God could do, would create intelligent life. But it could be there's more. And this is one fairly simple hypothesis I think I've articulated of what that reason is. And there is fairly significant evidence in support of it, I believe, as I described. And, even if I'm, as I say, all I'm trying to get to is this is a credible possibility. I'm happy for other religions to also be credible possibilities. I suppose it can't be too many because you're going to get over it if it's got to be 30% each. But look, you'd actually, if there is a true religion, it's probably going to be a pretty big one, right? A global. There aren't that many global religions. I think sometimes you find atheists, not you guys, but saying there's all these millions of different religions. Like over half the planet is either Christian or Muslim, right? So that, and everything else is a lot fewer. So it's not like we've got all these millions of religions to choose from. So I don't know. This is a possibility. So I'm starting from. I'm trying to repeat myself now. I'm starting from the world was created for a reason. Here's a fairly simple hypothesis that has some evidence in support of it about what that reason is.
All right, let's move on. Alex, do you want to talk about the atonement? Why don't you unpack what your thoughts were? You wrote this blog post. Maybe explain to the audience, what you had to say in there.
Yeah. Okay. So it was because when this all started was, I guess, when you came out, Philip, and had that moment where you were saying, I'm sort of tentatively a type of Christian, etc., etc., and then we read your article, and I sort of So there was one point where you talked about this participation theory of the atonement, right? And It's not something I knew a huge amount about, but you referenced this paper by Restall and Bain. So I went and got the paper and read that carefully to see what they were saying. And maybe, did I misunderstand this? But I thought you sort of lukewarm endorsed that. You weren't like, this is my view, everything they say is exactly what I think. But you were like, this is somewhat close to what I think. Was that right? Or am I misremembering?
Yeah, so look, to be fair, I think the
hang on, Philip, wait 1 second. Can we just back up and explain the participatory theory of the atonement? I think you did say it in the introduction, but I think just a quick recap on what this theory is.
I suppose in its broadest thought form is salvation is all about God participating in our form of existence that somehow facilitates us participating in God's form of existence. And that's a kind of family of views. And yeah, I mean, I'm kind of closer to Robin Collins's view, but I think his papers are not necessarily. I was kind of on his website and stuff. So then I think maybe Eon went for the Bain and Restall paper. So yeah, and maybe my view is a little bit different to that, but I do think you misunderstood their view a little bit because you had it all about, we can relate to God, whereas I think it's more mystical than that. I mean, all the participatory is, it's about a sort of mystical connection between God and humanity. And Bain and Restall, as I understand it, most of the paper's kind of negative, and then their positive view is just a small bit, is just that we share in Christ's death and resurrection, right? So God shared in death and then resurrected, and we Christians somehow mystically share in his death in some sense and thereby his resurrection. So I don't think it's more metaphysical, more mystical than what you were talking about. But yeah, to be fair, it's a bit different to my view. And I suppose what I should have said was, maybe I threw this in, but I should have said it's just the standard view of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is closer to what I described, that it's just the aim is to be unified with God, but God's too different. And so, and I quoted Robin Collins in the paper that's probably closer to this. And so we can sort of enter into unity with God if God's a bit more like us. That's
okay, good. That's fine. So I think we don't need to talk about the Baines and Restall paper. It doesn't matter because who cares about that? Because what we're talking about is it's a more generic view. It's just the kind of, as you described it, then it's about being able to, here are the terms that you're using, stuff about participating in and unifying with, and stuff like that. And I guess if that's what we're looking at in particular, my issue here is that I just don't know what's going on. That's where I'm at. I don't know what that means. And I think my simple brain worries that, like, the simple thing, I mean, I've had this thought completely independently of any of this stuff, was thinking about like theories of the afterlife and kind of working out what I think about those. And broadly speaking, they come in, let's say, two types. This is obviously massively simplistic, but like two types. One where afterlife is like a sequence of experiences, just like being alive, but sort of different qualitatively. Maybe it's like better or whatever, but it's still, in theory, I could be counting natural numbers, die, wake up in heaven and keep counting, and it would be a continuous dictation of the ordinals or something, right? In theory, that would mean it was just sequence, just like we currently have. Then the other views is it's not like that. So the afterlife is not a sequence of experiences, and then some sort of versions of that idea involve terms that are similar to what you're talking about, which is like you kind of unify with God. It's a kind of like a oneness, a kind of participation in God's being, stuff like this. Theologians say that stuff. But I think I struggle to make sense of that idea because, here's one way into my worry is that, like, if you take this cliche kind of resurrection kind of sort of like Buddhist idea that I could like die and then I'll wake up and I might be like a dog or something and I have another life, and then maybe I die and wake up again and I have a different life after that. I guess I kind of worry with that like it's hard to see how there's anything continuous, right? Like, how is it still me, right? What about that is me still? Because I won't remember my old life. And like, it's, I just don't know what that is. And so there's this worry that identity doesn't survive that process. And I think I sort of worry that if I unify with God too much, I just haven't survived that at all. It's no different from just being completely annihilated. So I wonder, like, with that, and here, it's just not like a ponage moment or anything. I don't have a good argument. I'm just curious. Like, I don't understand the idea. And, I had this kind of worry that if you take all this unification stuff too seriously, doesn't that push out any space left over for me to continue to exist in a sense that's kind of significant, right? Like, how can I be unified with God and also me still? Right? I guess that's my worry in a nutshell. So I've done a thumbs up emoji by accident now. I didn't mean to.
On your camera, it was zooming in and out. It was doing like crazy stuff.
Sorry, I really do want to turn that off, but I don't know how. Anyway.
Okay. Philip, go ahead.
Yes. Well, maybe there's two things you're asking for clarity here. What does it mean to be unified with God? And I think there's something we can say that's fairly simple in a sense here. It's just like a part-whole relationship, that we're not part of God, but us and God are part of a greater whole with a deep organic unity. Jesus has this metaphor of the vine and the branches. So that's fairly clear. I mean, obviously, this is going to be something beyond our comprehension in any more detail, but that's the basic idea. And I suppose, in all traditions, in all of the great religions, there are these mystical traditions, Kabbalah in Judaism and Sufism in Islam, and then, in Hinduism, I'm more familiar with that. So, and they often have this sense of oneness. So in Hinduism, it's literally losing your identity, getting absorbed in the divine. An analogy like an ice cube melting in the ocean is what one Hindu mystic gives. So then I'd have you worry, okay, I'd lose my identity. But this isn't like this. This is I stay me. It's more the oneness of a married couple, right? It's like I stay me, but I'm in this deeply unified part-whole relationship with God. So that's one thing that I think is kind of clear enough. Obviously, it's going to be hugely mysterious, but then there's the issues about personal identity. I've got in the paper that I sent you guys this huge footnote on personal identity that I wish I should have read in advance. I mean, it's really simple. I think if you're a substance dualist, then it's simple, right? It's just your soul, your individual particular soul becomes part of this part-whole relationship. But then it's trickier if, I don't know. I go through all the options of different theories of personal identity, animalism. Maybe if you're an animalist, I don't know. I can't remember them now. I go through. This is something I'd like to delve into in a bit more detail. And obviously, I mean, look, I'm at the end of the day, I want to I think it's fine to say, I think it's compatible with this being a rational position to have faith in that. I'm not sure what all these details are going to work out as. It's this general idea of the unity point, but yeah, I do try to run through different options with different theories of mind about how it might still be you, with different theories of personal identity as well. But yeah, that's the basic idea.
Dan, is there anything you want to say on this topic, or should we move on to the next one?
No, I think we've covered everything. I mean, right.
Okay. Yeah. So the next one is about the resurrection, and this is a data point. Dan, do you want to talk about that? Like, we've got these appearances, the rise of Christianity. Is that not best explained by an actual resurrection?
Right. I mean, this is sort of returning to an issue that I raised earlier with the Christmas Carol. Obviously I'm not an expert on the early history of Christianity, but as far as I'm aware, we're really the only things that we have from antiquity are just the earliest sources are the four Gospels, and then there's one Jewish historian whose name escapes me right now that I think wrote something around the year 90 about.
I think it's Josephus.
Josephus, yes, right, yeah. So and those are our sources from the first century, by and large, and it. Now, you were taking it as a datum that there's multiple eyewitnesses to various events, like various visitations by Jesus, but of course we don't actually have those, right? Like, we have reported that there were visitations of that sort, and so the explanatory task here is not to explain why people had those visitations, but why it was recorded that there were those visitations. And it seems to me that that's like a very different that's very different from an evidential standpoint than if we had a whole bunch of different documents from antiquity. And so, if we, like I was saying before, I think even the theist should begin with the mindset that most of the people who have ever claimed to be deified or returned from the dead or whatever haven't actually done so. And so even someone that believes in theism or in the supernatural more generally should already have a low prior for these particular accounts.
Philip?
There was one straightforward error in what you said then, that the earliest sources of the Gospels, actually the earliest thing in the Bible is the 7 genuine letters from Paul.
Yes, right, that's of course
25 years later. And all scholars think 7 of the 13 are correct. And as I say, he as I said earlier, he didn't know Jesus, but he knew a lot of the people. James, Peter, Jesus' rock, James, the brother of Jesus, John, another of the 12, and spent extended time with these people. So I do think this is pretty unique from the standards of ancient history. At least it's not just legends, mythological reports after, and this is why, look, just what you have just said would be your approach. None of the experts, including the passionate atheists, did not adopt that. Not all of them, except that these people who on Paul's list had these experiences pretty early on, and this is what kicked it off, right? Peter and Mary Magdalene, at least most people would say that the 12 disciples as well. So I do think that there is strong evidence that for those cases. I mean, I just find, like, I listen to these debates between the William Lane Craigs and the Bart Ehrmans, and I think I'm always the middleweight guy, but I think they're both right and wrong. Like William Lane Craig saying this is really strong evidence, and Bart Ehrman saying you can't prove a bloody miracle with historical evidence, and they're both right. What they, Bart
Ehrman's, so look, I don't think
what he should be. Just let me just finish this point very quickly. What he should be saying is, and is the probability the prior is too low for this evidence. It's impressive evidence, but the prior is too low. And they mostly agree on the evidence.
So first of all, I'm embarrassed that I made the mistake about the Paul's letters. I did, of course, know that. But anyway, okay,
hang on. Can I just interrupt one second?
Yes.
One thing about Paul is Paul never met Jesus, right?
This is important.
So he is not a witness. When he had his vision, he didn't know what Jesus looks like. So maybe he can say it's a second hand because he knew the other disciples, but Paul himself cannot be counted as a witness to the resurrection.
That's
right. Not in the sense that we think of,
I think, but look, I think so on the one hand, Paul can't be counted as a witness to the resurrection, at least the kinds of resurrection claims that are attributed to other people, right? But I think there's a more general point here, which is that the way that I would characterize what I've seen biblical historians say about this topic is that the best explanation of the fact that we have of what people wrote in either Paul's letters or in the Gospels is that that there were people that had these visitation experiences. But that's not taking it as a datum. The datum there is that the text says what it says. The best explanation of that fact is that there were these witnesses. And so that's already like in a different place. But look, let's suppose this happened today. Let's suppose that this wasn't an ancient event, and there were a bunch of people running around today, one of whom said that they saw a bright light in the sky and that the light was indication of some otherworldly being, and they had messages from that being, just as Paul said. And let's suppose there were other people who claimed that they had firsthand experience with these beings or people or whatever. Well, we have those kinds of reports, right? So we call them alien abduction reports, and we don't think that the best explanation, at least, I don't know what your views on alien abductions are, but I think most people have the view that alien abduction reports are not credible, even though they there are many people who claim to have had these kinds of experiences. There are many people who independently report them. There are many people who have had their lives have been radically transformed by the experience they've had. In that case, we don't have to have a debate about whether or not there were these people. There really are people who have had this kind of experience. And then the further question is what the rest of us should do about the fact that there are people who have said that they've had that kind of experience.
Yeah, just quick point on the, I don't know how much it matters, but I think you were expressing what I would say is a bit of a dodgy understanding of the epistemology of testimony. I think testimony is more foundational than look at this report, what best. I think Richard Bauckham, the Christian New Testament scholar, has a very, in the end of his book, Jesus and the Eyewitness, he got a very philosophically sophisticated account dealing with the nature of the testimony, the epistemology of testimony. I think it's basically foundational. Prima facie, you trust testimony. I don't think we could get history off the ground if we didn't have that. So I think like we don't say, I'm having this sense datum, therefore the best explanation is a table that, it's just foundational trusting. But I don't think it matters, so maybe let's not get lost. But I agree with what you look. It's just about priors. I agree with you. Yeah, there's powerful evidence for all sorts of things. The Mary Celeste, let's not get into that. I'm not going to ramble. Yeah, I think these I haven't looked into these cases of alien abduction, but maybe I'd be happy to say it's pretty powerful evidence. But the prior's too low. Extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. What's his name? Capturing Christianity. Bertuzzi is going on about the Marian apparitions. I think the Marian apparitions are very impressive evidence. But my prior for the truth of Catholicism, for all sorts of reasons, their views on condoms and being gay being one thing, is so low it doesn't get them up there. So I think this is normal. What I would say is this is impressive evidence in the sense that if it were a mundane event, it would be a no-brainer. And for you should reject it, and you should be skeptical because you don't believe in a God of limited powers. But if you do believe in a God of limited powers, and this hypothesis fits pretty well with that, then this suddenly clicks in as important evidence.
So Dan, hang on, Dan. Last thing to say, and then I want to get Alex in on a second.
Suppose that I say that, given the vastness of the universe or something like this, that I do believe that there's alien life out there. I've heard people make that claim, at least. Suppose I'm someone who believes that. Then if you believe that there's alien life out there, then of course you're open to the possibility that they could be visiting Earth and grabbing people and mutilating cows and all the rest of it. But I don't think that's what someone that believes in the reality of alien life would ought to say. I think it is a very compelling case. And then you hear people so Carl Sagan didn't say, oh yeah, we should believe in alien abduction experiences because I have this large prior that there is alien life out there. Rather, what someone like Sagan said was, while on the one hand I believe in alien life, these eyewitness reports of visitations by such entities are not themselves credible. And it seems to me that the theist should be in precisely the same position with respect to someone like Jesus, who claims to be the incarnation of a deity.
Well, why aren't they credible? I mean, I haven't looked into them in much detail. Again, surely it must be priors in the sense that, I mean, not saying Sagan had sort of worked out a sophisticated view on this, but if there were multiple attestations to some mundane event, you'd accept it like that. The reason we don't trust these testimonies, not because there's something necessarily wrong with the testimony, but we have a very low prior that aliens have visited us, and we can debate why that is. Similarly, it all hangs on, you're just assuming there's no credibility to someone, but to Jesus being God. We have to look at the hypothesis and what prior we attach to the hypothesis. And I think what you should be doing is debating me on the case I made for a reasonable prior to it, conditional on my God of limited powers. And you haven't said anything to question that. I'm saying relative to the hypothesis, because we're starting from the idea that there is a purpose to the universe, and this is a fairly small extension of God's powers. We should give it a reasonable prior. And And
Alex, what do you want to say about this? Oh, you're muted, I think, Alex. You're muted.
Sorry
That's
about
okay.
that.
No worries.
Boomer moment. I feel like I missed something about what the connection is between the limited God hypothesis and this testimony. I'm like, it's an interesting conversation, but I feel like I've missed a bit. Like, how is there? Can you just explain to me the connection between the two things?
It's just a matter of separating evidence from the prior probability of the hypothesis. So I think the evidence for the resurrection, and remember, I have an unusual view of the resurrection, that it's visionary. And that's why I would put Paul on the list as one of the witnesses, because I think they were all visions. Anyway, I think the evidence for the resurrection, whether it's the traditional version or my visionary version, is very strong, of the form that if it were a mundane event, it would be a no-brainer, everyone would accept it. The problem is the prior probability, but I think on God of limited powers, it has a reasonable prior probability. Why? Two reasons. One, that priors, when we're talking about theories of fundamental reality, we should judge it on simplicity. And I think this is a fairly simple extension of God's powers relative to what you need for fine-tuning. So we should think of it along the lines of, if you had a theory in fundamental physics and you had a slight extension to it, you'd give a reasonable prior to that. Second reason is, if we're starting from this point of view that God created the universe for a reason, it could be that this is the reason, this is all God could do, but we should be open to, no, maybe there's something more. And this is a coherent, fairly simple hypothesis about what the more is, that it's this becoming unified with God. It's, it could be that. I think you should, from the starting point of a God limited, you say, yeah, that could be true. And then there's this evidence.
So sometimes I feel like you're saying quite an easy thing to nod along to, which is like, this could be the case. And I'm understanding the could there in a sort of epistemic sense. And yeah, it could. For all I know, the limited God hypothesis is true. I want to say it could be true in that epistemic sense, and that's fine. And if that's all we're doing, then really quick conversation, because I'm just like, yeah, okay, you win, because like it could be true. But then sometimes I think you're saying, but it's not just that it could be true, because that wouldn't be very interesting if that's all it was. Actually, it's not that it is true, because that's too strong, but always like the middle ground guy, right? But you want to say something like it's slightly stronger than just mere epistemic possibility, weaker than a kind of deductive proof. So it's something like giving it a probability of, a substantial but not overwhelming probability.
I think Philip said about 30%, right?
Sure, that's
right?
what I mean by substantial, but not, overwhelming.
But can I just correct something? It's not about God of limited powers. They've got to distinguish these two. So the first stage is the God of limited powers, and I believe that. I think there's really strong evidence for that. I would say, I believe that. And until you agree with me on that, unless you agree with me on that, you shouldn't listen to anything I'm saying about the resurrection, because it's all foundational. What I'm saying is, once that's in the bag, then you should say Christianity, as I've described it, could be true. In what sense could be true? In the sense that, that's in the sense that you'd say if you had a well-supported theory in physics and there was this slight modification of it that you didn't yet have evidence for, let's say, a slight modification, you should say, that could be true. Take that. We'll give a reasonable prior to that. What's the evidence? So I think you should think of it like that. You should think. Should think my version of Christianity is like, that's true. That's true. That could be an option. It's like a real live option. And then we turn to this evidence for the resurrection and what an extraordinary moral teacher he was, and the fact that it has become one of the hugest religions, which is probably a necessary condition, necessary but not sufficient condition. But anyway, that's it. And as I say, I'm not saying this is even bigger than 50%.
Yeah, that's right. But I think
is that clearer?
So that definitely does help clear things up for me to some extent. So the idea is that, like, let's just say now, at this part of the conversation, playing the game, limited God hypothesis is on the table. We've established it. Let's just say that we have. So we can move on to the second part of the conversation. Then the thought is, we're saying there's a substantial but not completely overwhelming probability that Christianity is true, given the hypothesis of limited God in the first place. Cool. So given that that's where we are, I still think that there's something like So I sort of got this worry that there's something sort of a bit ad hoc about sort of saying, sometimes like saying, well, maybe, you know, I think I can remember from the article, there was something about like you had this backwards worry and a forwards worry, which was like, how come Jesus hadn't, you know, come down loads of times before? Or was it they hadn't been, more people hadn't been resurrected or something? And then the forward-looking one, how come he didn't stick around longer? Right? This is something you said your dad had said to you at some point. So right, and so, but just sort of, I think that your idea, and correct me if I got this wrong, was that it was something like you go, well, maybe when God sort of manifests as a person and becomes physical, maybe he can't do that twice. It can only happen once.
Yeah.
Right. And that struck me as like, I'm struggling to see how that bit of the hypothesis could possibly be given a substantial probability. That just seems like epistemically, I guess it could be that it could only do it once, but I don't see that there's any reason to think that he could. So how do I promote that out of just being just a possibility to being anything more than that?
Yeah, we're getting into the details now. So maybe we could perhaps put this in the show notes. I don't know. And the blog post I wrote in response to your video, I haven't made this paper public yet, but yeah, this is my biggest worry about it. Like, if God can incarnate, this was, yeah, my dad was a lifelong practicing Catholic who didn't really believe any of it and said, why didn't Jesus stick around? You know, I think this is this is the thing that, you know, I'm less than 50% about this. This is the thing that is the biggest doubt. You know, if God could do that, why not do it more often? So I suppose what I say in the paper is it's not logically guaranteed, but it's not so implausible that if God does totally fuse a bit of God's self with a bit of physical reality, such that they're just now one entity, one unified entity, which is the standard Christian view, that couldn't then be undone because they've just fused into one thing, and that can then no longer be undone. I mean, I suppose maybe you disagree, and we'll see what people think of this. I suppose it seems to me, yeah, it's not logically inevitable, but it's not so implausible that it doesn't seem a totally arbitrary add-on. But maybe it's a judgment call. But yeah, that's
well,
that does lower the prior, though. That does lower the prior. You know, that
sure.
addition,
yeah.
every addition. You know, which I didn't mention in my presentation.
But the thing that would help me with how much it lowers the priors is, at least if I can sort of see a wider theoretical environment in which that posit sort of sits comfortably. If it just sort of pops out of nothing, then I just, if someone says, well, I don't know, maybe, if I like, how come I can't find one of my shoes? And you say, well, maybe you never had two shoes, and you just thought you did, or something. That's epistemically possible, but that came out of nowhere. There's no actual reason to think that. Very different if you said, you've got a long mental health history. That here are the records of you constantly thinking you've got 2 feet and you've only got one. Blah blah blah. Now I've got a kind of wider framework within which me on this occasion saying this one thing is now no longer quite as ad hoc and sort of unreasonable. So and it's here. It's like so what you're saying to provide in the analogy, the kind of medical records and the context to it, is you've got this wider idea of the unification thing. I suppose that's still what's puzzling to me. So, but that is helpful, I think. And we can't possibly settle this now. All we can do is sort of, I'm just asking you some questions and you're fleshing it out a bit, which is fair enough. But it's helpful for me. I'm learning, like I always do on this program.
Thank you. And, I appreciate all the challenges. And yeah, this is the bit that most raises my doubts. Also, I suppose Paul seemed to think it was all going to happen a bit quicker. That there are things that raise doubts here, and but I don't know. It still seems to me just as I'm trying to think of a good example from theoretical physics where you need something doesn't work about the theory, and you say, well, maybe this is true, maybe this addition is true, or maybe something cuts down the dark energy, although that's problematic.
Oh, dark matter, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Maybe
there's dark matter. You say, what the hell is that? Some extra addition that you're not logic. You've got no independent reason, but seems to account for the data better. And so I'm trying to say, look, if we add this extra little posit that once this bit of God is fused with physical reality, that can't be undone. That makes sense of this data and yields this satisfying explanation. And the more you do that, the more you do that, and you've got to say this and you've got to say, then it will get to the point. And a version of this about a month ago, my first version of this, I was thinking, no, I was about to give up on. It was really low in my prior. I think I'm open-minded. I was really low in my prior because I was just adding all these things, and then I just went to this simpler view of what I just described. And yeah, I don't know. At the moment, it seems to me doesn't add too much to lower the prior.
I guess I don't. If I can ask a clarifying question about this, because I'm not sure I understand it. So the question was, why didn't God incarnate multiple times? And the answer, if I understand it, was that, well, if God fuses with physical reality in this one place, in the person of Jesus, then that can't be undone. I guess the reason I don't quite understand that is that, supposing that that's right, that God can't be unfused from Jesus once they're fused, why can't the Jesus God composite then also fuse with other parts of physical reality?
Yeah, I think I do go into this in footnotes after I recall the paper. I should have reread the paper before. Yeah, so I suppose. Yeah, would we have to add an extra posit here that? So you've got this thing that is now has this physical nature. So what it would? So is your idea it would then fuse with another physical thing? So
yeah,
so it's
potentially. I mean, I don't know what prevents that.
It's a good point. I might have to look back at the paper to see whether. I mean, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, and there are.
You don't want to just say it can. It can't. Or I mean, I suppose you could just say this can't be done more than once. Would that be once you're fused with one physical thing, you can't then fuse with another physical thing? Would that be lower the prior too much to have that slight extra addition?
I don't know. I mean, I really just don't understand what the intuition is supposed to be. If it can fuse the one time, I don't know why it can't fuse the multiple times. And I take it that the explanation can't be, because it can only happen once, right? Because that was what we were in the business of wanting to explain in the first place. It's why it can only happen once. And I don't.
Well, it's a different kind of transformation, isn't it? It's something that's non-physical fusing with something physical to make a unified person, right? A unified person. Now, when that sort of unified physical divine person is it so implausible to say, well, that can't then that unified organic physical person, especially I suppose if you're thinking of a person in a sort of Aristotelian sense, where it's this unified organic whole, can't then unify with another person, so would it become like two persons in one body or something? I mean, look, there are debates in the panpsychism literature about could two minds become one mind? Could they, or one mind be a part of another mind? And it's
right.
It's not so implausible to think. It seems to be something a bit weird about that. So maybe it's not so implausible to say, look, once you've got this physical person, that can't then unify with another physical person.
So Alex, I want to bring Alex in because he wants to say something.
But these are good points that I want to think about more, and I might change my mind on. Go on.
Yeah, sure.
Here's a sort of friendly challenge, right, on that, which is, you might say, well, once you've crossed the bridge from being non-physical to unifying with something that's physical, that's the hard bit, right? That can only happen once, maybe definitionally, because once you're partly physical, then, to some extent you're physical, right? That's that, unless you undo the unification or something, that's only going to happen once. But once you're physical, unifying two physical things together is a trivial thing, right? I can grab the leg of this chair and just, drill it onto this table, and now I've unified the two things. Unifying physical things is easy. right? So how come, right? If it's already physical, even easier, right? So then you can sort of talk yourself into thinking, no, actually, it should be able to do it again, right? There's a sort of this is what I wanted with some like wider theoretical understanding of something. And I'm just making stuff up, obviously, but like that was one way where you could do that to draw the picture that makes it look like he should. I'm emphasizing your dad's worry now with this, I guess.
I mean, I think what you're pointing to illustrates that there's nothing logically inevitable about this edition. You could set things up in a plausible way that it would be possible to do this lots of times. But I think actually, yeah, I mean, maybe building on a more Aristotelian notion of a person as a fundamental organic whole, then you can see why in that sense it might be more of a jump, right? Because now you've got this unified organic whole person. It might be more of a jump to unify that with another person. Can two persons literally become one person, fuse into one person? Not obvious they can't, but you can see it's not totally ad hoc. There are independent discussions where you think there's something a bit dodgy about that. So I don't know if I'm right. Maybe I've just thought of this solution now, and I'm thinking it's quite a good solution, actually. Maybe I need to rework this paper.
I guess the two things...
Oh, go on, Dan.
Well, I guess so sort of pulled in two directions here. But one is that I would have thought that with respect to the combination problem, you would have, like as a panpsychist, you would have said that you can unify consciousnesses together to make a bigger consciousness. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just the other thing I wanted to put out there, and I guess this is just something that's like super friendly to you, is that if you did say that God could incarnate more than once, then this might actually help with some of the other issues that you've sort of tangentially mentioned, that like, this problem of religious pluralism, because now you could say, oh, well, these other individuals who might claim to be various incarnations of deities, perhaps they were in some sense.
It's an invitation to get more heretical.
Right.
But I am thinking. Oh, can I say something after you've said something, Phil? Or
yeah, go for it.
Oh, I just said very briefly. I am thinking it's more and more plausible now that I mean, because the traditional Christian idea is that it's the sort of fusion happens as the embryo forms, as the person forms, and then once you've got a physical person, could that then be fused with another forming embryo? I don't know. It's not so implausible to me to say that's just not an option. Now I'm thinking about it, but I'll think more about, like I said to Alex O'Connor when he's trying to push Gnosticism onto me. I'm open. Look, actually, let me just say very briefly, before my big conversion, I've been going to church for a decade as a fictionalist, as taking it all metaphorically, and I'd be quite happy to slide back into that. I do think I'm enjoying a deeper spiritual experience as I've taken seriously this Eastern Orthodox stuff, but I'll think more about. It's an interesting proposal that could this make sense of religious pluralism as different incarnations. I'll think about that.
Alex, did you want to say a quick thing? Otherwise, there's one last thing I want to say, and then I think we should wrap up. Okay, all right. So there's one thing that I just don't quite get, Philip, and maybe you can help me understand this. And this is the issue of God's limited powers. Like, no conscious being we've ever seen can change the consciousness of nature. So that seems like a big ask for a conscious being to do. And then when we go back to the problem of suffering, like one of the things that I said would alleviate enormous amounts of suffering is to make us vegetarian. And what that would take is maybe some genetic manipulation. And we know conscious beings can manipulate genes. And in fact, we've even discovered that one of the things that makes it difficult for people to be vegan is there's some genetic tendency that people find it hard to do. And those people that have those genes, or I don't know if it's a single gene or a cluster of genes, they find it difficult. God could surely, how could it be that he can change the conscious nature? He can create these resurrection experiences, but he can't do that simple change to alleviate enormous amounts of animal suffering. That I really, really struggle with. Maybe you can help me understand that.
Well, just let me say first, I'm very, very much on your side with the animal suffering case against the traditional omni-god. This is, and I think this has become more pronounced to us as our morality has developed, and we've become more rightly sensitive to animal suffering. And but yeah, I suppose I still feel that what you're saying is premised on this, to my mind, incorrect idea that power is always on a scale. So you used to say we got this much, but whereas there are different kinds of power. God is a very different kind of mind to us. God isn't a naturally evolved mind that has these flexibilities of an evolved creature. I mean, look, I've given a specification of God's powers that rules this out. So I think the only question is, how simple is that? Does it deal with the data? This is what I think fundamental theories should do: fit the data and be fairly simple. And so I think it is fairly simple. And it fits the data, and it avoids your counterexample. So yeah, I don't know what's the problem with it apart from
Well, I guess it's the fact that he can do some miracles, right? I mean, the resurrection. Do you think that Jesus walked on water, or that he turned the water into wine, or that he exorcises demons and healed the sick? I mean, these are quite a few different miracles, and that's where it feels to me the implausibility. Like, how is it that he can do these? I mean, I don't know which miracles. Like, do you think the Exodus happened? Because it seems that Jesus does think the Exodus happened. So if you're going to be a Christian and then say the Exodus didn't happen, that is going to look trickier, shall we say. So I guess that's where my problems lie. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, there's different things going on here. If we're just talking about fine-tuning, this is why I'm so much more confident in a God of limited powers. If we're just dealing with, like, maybe a deistic one,
yeah.
If we're just dealing with that, then I don't see the force of your criticism at all. It gets trickier when we're going into Christianity, but I think my slight modification to get us the incarnation and my weird version of the resurrection is sort of fairly on safe ground. Now, I mean, the final section of my paper is exploring, well, what about other miracles? And I mean, here I'm just that, at best agnostic, and it doesn't really matter to me very much. I think it wouldn't be too hard to make sense of Jesus having some impressive healing capabilities. He was this, if it's true, he's this unique individual as God incarnate. Maybe he could have, certain limited, particular special healing powers. But this sort of stuff, the more grand stuff, calming storms and stuff, yes, then you're going to be in a worry that how can you make sense of that without being too powerful to do much more? So I suppose I'm much more skeptical about that. And I mean, what I say basically is I'm not a reductionist physicalist. I am more and more inclined. Partly, I believe in libertarian free will these days. So I do think that there's new causal principles at higher levels of reality, and we don't know what's going on there. So maybe limited God has some limited power there, and we are beyond our understanding. But that's all wildly speculative, and to be honest, it doesn't really matter for my faith. I'm going to come back to what's important for your faith, and what's important to me is this, is the stuff I've talked about, that this unity between God and humanity, and that particular way of making sense of the oneness mystical idea that's present in all religions. One thing that really resonates with me is that you have love in the final oneness you're aiming at, as opposed to Hinduism, and much respect as I've got for Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, because you get absorbed in the divine and there's no different persons, there's no love in the final picture, whereas you've got that oneness in this Eastern Orthodox story, but there's interpersonality, and so love within the final goal, and that really makes a lot more sense to me at spiritual level. So this is what I'm focused on for my living life, not whether Jesus calmed a storm or whatever.
Okay, so we're talking about finality. I think we should wrap things up. Dan and Alex, if you want to say a few more comments, and then we'll let Philip have the final say, and we'll finish there. Dan, do you want to say anything on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So I think you are right about. So back when we were talking about testimony, you brought up that the one sophisticated way to think about the epistemology of testimony is if we're, for example, phenomenal conservatives. We believe that the testimony will have, unless we have a defeater for that testimony. Yeah. More generally about experience. But again, like with drawing the analogy with Scrooge disbelieves the experience he's having, not because he's not a phenomenal conservative. I mean, he doesn't say what his philosophical views are, of course. But if he were a phenomenal conservative, then the fact that he knows that people who are similarly positioned as him have hallucinations of precisely the kind that he might be having, that he takes to be a defeater for the experience that he thinks that he's having. And likewise, I think what we say about, I think what we're tempted to say about supernatural experiences today, even if we believe in either aliens or in the supernatural or whatever, in any of those cases, the testimony that we have today is much better accounted for than the testimony that we have from antiquity. And yet most people today are not willing to make the kinds of claims about the testimony today that they make about the testimony from antiquity. I think what we should say there is that, well, since the testimony we have from antiquity, we have it's not as well recorded as say the testimony that alien abductees or contactees or others have reported today. That's much better reported than the 10 or so documents we have from antiquity. Right. So I think that's where I end up with how I would think about the issue if I already accepted the limited God hypothesis. As far as the fine tuning, I think the hobby horse that I keep beating whenever I have this conversation is that philosophers have really gone off in a direction that departs from the way that many physicists want to talk about fine tuning. I think when you look at fine tuning as not as a datum but as a theoretical vice, then we come to a different place with respect to our judgments about the fine tuning argument.
Right, Alex, last say, and then we'll let Philip have the very final say.
Okay, so I guess my lingering thought was that Philip's idea is, with the limited God hypothesis, it's got like these two selling points with these two good explanatory kind of virtues to them. And just, it's not criticism of the theory as much, but it's just my perspective. Like, why don't I agree in the same way? It's partly because I don't see those as being so great. So it's not as good a bargain as Philip thinks it is. And that's just because we have very different views on the problem of fine tuning in the first place, and how a hypothesis that solves the problem in the way that Philip wants this hypothesis to do seems to me giving the problem more credibility or something than it should have. So it's not such a virtue for me that it solves that problem. I'm not so worried about that problem anyway. And then it was the lingering issue of just like, I think that's the way. Maybe I'm missing it, but I think that's why you're confident of the limited God hypothesis in the first place is the explanatory power that it has as a theory. And it's simple and it has good explanatory power, so it's a good theory. That was the idea, I think. But for me, because I'm not seeing the explanatory power being as good, I'm still left looking at it as a theory, which just strikes me as like occupying a very small range of the possible theories out there. Like it's possible in that epistemic sense, but it's no more or less possible than maybe God is incompetent. That's one of Hume's hypotheses in the dialogues, right? I mean, that also explains a bunch of stuff too. I mean, limited God hypothesis, in a way, is an umbrella term that includes the incompetent God, right, or whatever, right? Or maybe God, just wants there to be beach balls or something, and is crap at manifesting that. So most things aren't beach balls, but occasionally some things are, right? And that's one hypothesis or something. Like, you can just make these up, and I'm not trying to sort of reduce the hypothesis in order to make it easier to dismiss. I'm just trying to kind of characterize an idea so that it's clear and I find it very hard to speak small sentences and go on for ages. So like trying really hard to say it quickly. But yeah, I'm left thinking, well, it's just one of the things that I could dream up that might be possible. Like, and that's it. So it's interesting. It's a super interesting idea, but I'm not persuaded. I'm not going to join the Church of the Limited God. It was probably super cool there, actually. Probably way chill or something. But like, yeah.
All right, Philip, final thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for engaging with this and giving some really, really good challenges and much to keep thinking about. And yeah, I suppose I like the way Dan phrased that. There's, just test me until you have a defeater. I think that's a lot of what's going on, actually. And I think in the alien cases, you've got a defeater because of the low prior. And likewise, if you're an atheist, when you're looking at the evidence for the resurrection, you've got a defeater because of the low prior. But I'm saying this theory, if you're already believing in a God-limited powers, has a reasonable prior. So the things that are going to change my mind are the things we got to towards the end, like, is this just these additions to avoid God coming back? Yeah, then it's lowering the prior. At some point, it's going to become a defeater. But I think that's what it hangs on. I think, to my mind, it is difficult to deny that there is pretty powerful evidence here. Yeah, it's not it's not evidence like that you'd have in the modern day, or something's been filmed or something. But it's comparable to evidence that for things we just totally take for granted in ancient history. But it's just because, understandably, relative to certain worldviews, it has a really, really, really low prior. Yeah. So I guess for well, it seems for Alex too, it's coming back to the fine tuning, which is, there's a big debate here, isn't there? That was the other fine tuning thing with Dan's point about his central point here. The
difference between the philosophers and the physicists.
I see this point in the case of the cosmological constant, that there's a reason to think there's something funny going on here, additions to fine tuning. But I suppose I would like to hear, running out of time, for example, with the mass of an electron, right? If our theory says electrons have this mass, and if it had been a little bit different one way or the other, we wouldn't have life. Why is that a fault with the theory? Why is that? And if the theory is true, that's, it has that mass. Why is that a fault with the theory? So I suppose I'd want to hear more about how this works in these other cases. Yeah, with Alex's point, look, I'm open to all these possibilities. I really do. These other different conceptions of God or something goddish. That's what my why book was about, trying out all these different options. And it's open to me, all I'm getting is a credible possibility. It's open to me to say, maybe some of these are equally possible. I could say other religions are equally possible. There can't be too many, because then the probability space runs out. But that's an option. But what I think is powerful about the God-limited powers, I do think it's very simple, at least if we're dealing with just fine-tuning, because I do think you can tell a story about the limitations that's simpler than physics, and you've just got this perfectly good being. A lot of people say to me, well, why isn't in a slightly bad God? If it's a very bad God, you get, why is it good things? But maybe it's a slightly bad God. But whenever I talk through that with people, you end up with this complex psychology of this sort of bad and sort of good God. And how would that get exactly what you see? I think this is a really simple hypothesis. Good God with the limitations I quite precisely specified. Very simple hypothesis that I do think elegantly counts the data. And yeah, I do suspect, I don't want to, I'm not talking about you guys. I'm definitely not talking about you guys, but I think we do need to think about whether cultural biases are at play here. I think we're so well trained in the West to think about religious biases, but in any worldview, there are biases. And for whether or not it has force, you sound ridiculous if you're talking about these things. So we do need to think seriously about whether the reason fine-tuning isn't taken much more seriously are these cultural reasons that, haven't we ruled out God? Haven't we? And, the evidence changes, and maybe we need to rethink those cultural assumptions. But that's not really an argument. But, the fine-tuning argument's going to go on, isn't it? But
it certainly will.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much, Philip. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. It's been a super interesting chat. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you, the viewers, like this content, please give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you next time on the SciPhi Show.